Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Matt, thanks for having me. Great to be here. Really enjoy your show.
Well, thank you. And we got to thank our mutual friend, John Kuhn at Birdie, for introducing us. Really glad to meet you. So, let's start with what I like to call the state of the state with what's going on with you. So just to familiarize people with you who don't know you, tell us where you're at, what you call yourself, and the kind of work you do.
I'm primarily based out of Vancouver, BC, Canada. Been doing this for over 40 years. I'm a mix engineer. I do produce records sometime, but I'm not musically trained at all. So, I can't really get into helping co-write the song or write melodies or any of that stuff. So I tend to produce bands that I can add to, and they have everything pretty much, the songs written and how we like them. I can definitely help with arrangement, that kind of stuff. But, I really sort of pick the bands that I can really resonate with and really help them get a great sound and steer them along that way. So, but I'm primarily a mix engineer and I do a lot of recording as well, but mixing's kind of my thing.
Do you travel a bit?
It's been less and less travel over the years, as the budgets have shrunk and got smaller. I know in the early days, I think I was probably away from home 9 months of the year. And it's funny, my wife and I, we have 4 kids, and 2 of them were born in March and 2 of them were born in September. So we kind of joke, say, I guess I only get home twice a year.
That's what happens when you come home. More kids.
Yeah. But I'll still travel occasionally. But, since the internet came out and digital files and all that, usually I get sent the mix files digitally. I'll do my thing here in Vancouver, send it back to the band, have them, make any comments or approval, and we're kind of done. So there's less traveling.
Well, let's go a little bit back to the beginning. Where did you grow up originally?
I grew up outside of Vancouver at a place called Langley. So it was kind of a quite rural. I grew up on a farm. I was in a garage band when I was in junior high. And we're pretty terrible, but it sort of got my bug going. So then I quit school, grade 9. My dad and I had our own construction bulldozing outfit. I got bored of doing that because winters we'd shut down. So I thought, I got to get back into music, but I'm terrible at playing guitar. I'll never make any money at that. I wonder what the studio thing would be like. So I made a few calls and called a place called Little Mountain Sound, and they said they didn't have any positions open. They weren't hiring, but they needed a janitor if I was interested. So I thought, well, hey, great, foot in the door. So I started there as a janitor, and that lasted, I think, about 6 months before I started kind of moving up the slots to T-boy and assistant engineer and all that kind of stuff. So that was 1978, started doing that. So right at that time, Bob Rock was just becoming an engineer there. He was an assistant when I started as the janitor. And Bruce Fairbairn started doing a few projects there. So Bruce and Bob kind of hooked up. I think, Loverboy was the first sort of big record we did together. That garnered so much attention from Bon Jovi's and, AC/DC, Aerosmith, all that kind of stuff. So through the 80s, it had just kind of exploded there. And I got to engineer and mix a lot of great records. So it was kind of luck, but I was, kind of put myself in the position of, when luck hit, I was ready to go.
What a great spot to be at with Bruce and Bob.
Oh, perfect timing. It was just awesome.
Let's focus on that a little bit. I'd love to know some lessons learned, some takeaways from either one of them and those experiences. I think I was in junior high when the Loverboy records like Get Lucky were pretty hot, and knew then, even when I was just still a drummer and not a recording engineer at all, I thought, wow, these records sound really good. So what can you tell me about Bruce and Bob and your experiences there?
Well, Bruce was an amazing guy. He was kind of more like a coach. I mean, he had musical training in his background. He was a trumpet player sort of by trade. He was in a band called Prism at the time, and they had a horn section, and then they decided to sort of go more rock. So Bruce left the band as a trumpet player, but still wanted to be involved. So that's why he became a producer. He started producing the records. So anyways, he was more like a coach. He's really good at keeping the session moving along smoothly, keeping people engaged in the sessions so you don't get bogged down too much. He was always on time and under budget on all the records I ever did with him. He was just really good. He'd come in with his little clipboard every morning and say, okay, today we're going to do this and this and this. If we're doing a guitar solo and the guy's struggling a bit and he's trying to write it, he'd give him half an hour, but after that he says, okay, we're going to move on to something else. Go back to the hotel room, figure out what you want to do, and we'll do the solo later tonight. So he never let it bog down and let anybody get bored. It was always something was going on, and it sort of kept things moving, kept it light. So that was a great lesson I've learned off him. I can't emulate him as well as I should, but it was really good. I try and keep my sessions up and happy and try not to let them bog down. And then, of course, working with Bob Rock was amazing. He's got such great ears, really inventive in figuring out how to capture sounds, especially guitar. He's got killer guitar sounds, and I learned a lot off him from doing that. So, being part of that team really gave me some building blocks to kind of explore on my own after, I started branching out.
Did either one of them, obviously recording and recording techniques and maybe psychology is a bit on the plate there for discussion and learning with them. But what about business? Did they share any business tips with you that you gleaned?
Not really, because usually at the point of coming into the studio, like, all the business was done, and behind the scenes I was paid, I guess a salary or sort of per hour. We weren't salaried with the studio, but we're I guess independent contractors. So even as an assistant engineer, I keep track of my hours, and then at the end of the month I'd submit my hours and they'd bill it back to whatever projects we were on, and that's how I got paid. So I never got a salary per se, but I learned pretty early on to keep track of my time, because if I didn't keep track of it, nobody else was going to do it.
That's right.
And then really watching my money. I know before I started working in the studio business, you get your paycheck and you pretty much cash it at the bank. You'd have cash in your wallet, and then that lasted until your wallet was empty. I never had a bank account and all that. So I learned, no, you got to watch your money, because, you could have a really busy time, make a lot of money, and then all of a sudden, there's no work for 6 weeks. So you better have some money in the bank to, so you can pay your rent and all that stuff. So, I learned how to keep track of all that stuff.
You were relatively young then, right?
Yeah, I started 78. What was I, 18, 19, something like that. Yeah. So, yeah. And then I see some old pictures or video of me, back at say the Making of Pump in there. And I look like I'm like 12 years old. I'm like, oh my gosh, what the heck?
Yeah. I want to draw the listeners and the watchers' attention to that. That's actually a great video, The Making of Aerosmith's Pump.
Yeah.
Bruce is producing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're in there. Yeah. And it's really eye-opening. Now, unfortunately, Bruce passed, I can't remember when.
1999, because I remember, Bruce never got to see the millennium changeover.
Yeah. But wow, what an amazing experience you must have had there at the studio. How long did that run last for you?
At Little Mountain.
Yeah.
Sometime around 92, I think, was the last time I worked there. And I think it was the Coverdale Page record. We recorded the whole record there, and then we moved it all down to Miami, because both Jimmy and Jimmy Page and David Coverdale had houses down there. So just to get it out of Vancouver so they could just sort of hang at home while we did the record. So we moved it down to Miami. So I think that was around 92. I don't remember doing another session there, because right at that time, Little Mountain was sold to another guy. We weren't really agreeing on his direction he wanted the studio to go. So we kind of stopped going there.
Walk me through, like, once you hit Little Mountain and post Little Mountain, what are the stops there afterwards?
Well, so working with Bruce, I was an assistant engineer. It was me, Bruce Fairbairn and Bob Rock were sort of the team, and I was the assistant engineer. So when Bruce got the first Aerosmith call, and that was to do the Permanent Vacation record, so that was sort of their first, new breakout record. They were newly sober then, I think, 6 months sober or something like that. So they were like kids in the candy store and couldn't wait to get into the studio. Anyways, we started tracking that, and I think we're about a week and a bit into the tracking. Tracking usually takes about 4 weeks to do, and we're about a week and a little bit into it. And the time Bob Rock was in a band called the Payolas.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he came to Bruce one morning. He says, "Hey," he says, "we just got booked on this cross Canada tour." He says, "I got to leave this weekend for 6 weeks." So Bruce went, "Okay." He says, "Well, we'll just have Mike, finish engineering the record." So I ended up recording most of Permanent Vacation. And towards the end of it, Bruce had to go out of town on a business trip. So he said to me, he says, "Okay, well, when I'm gone over these 2 days," he says, "can I get you to do rough mixes of all the songs so that we can sort of send them out and see if we can, we'll find ourselves a mix engineer for the record." I'm like, "Okay, great." So I go in there the first day. I think I had one song ready to go. Stephen and Joe came in and took a listen. And they, "Yeah, you're not into this. You don't want to do this, do you?" And I was like crushed. I thought, "Oh, I hate it." He says, "No, you want to mix this record." I said, "Go for it." So I think we had 3 songs mixed by the time Bruce came back, and Bruce was pissed because he wanted it all mixed so that we could, carry on. He liked things being done. And Steven says, "No, Bruce," he says, "just check it out. Listen." So Bruce listened to the mixes and he goes, "Wow, I think we found our mix engineer." So I went from assistant engineering to mixing an Aerosmith record. So that really kicked the door wide open. So, the next one was probably Pump. So I did the whole thing, start to finish, recorded and mixed. I can't remember the chronological, but, then at some point, then AC/DC came in and wanted to finish off the record. They had recorded a bunch of it with the brother George in Ireland or something. And I think George got sick, or a family member got sick. So George couldn't finish it. So they got Bruce Fairbairn in, and just basically we needed to record vocals and Angus's solos, and it was pretty much done because they track things mostly live in the studio. There's not a lot of overdubs. So we went to sing a song, and it was in the wrong key for Brian. It just wasn't working. So they had to change the key of the song. So obviously we had to re-record the guitars and bass to the existing drums, and Brian sang it. And the brothers liked the sound of the instruments so much better, we ended up re-recording the instruments to all the rest of the songs. So, and then I got to mix that record. So, yes, because of that, since that record, that was Razor's Edge, since that, I've done all the records since. So I guess because I know what they want and their sound that they want, and I guess that they liked having that trust there.
Mm-hmm.
So, I've been through a few different producers with them, but I'm so far, knock on wood,
Yeah.
I've been their engineer. So that's been a great run. That's still continuing.
What an amazing run so far. I mean, I have to tell you, it's funny, I mentioned listening to Loverboy in junior high. I have a vivid memory of listening to Permanent Vacation in my 1972 Ford Maverick. And I was in southern New Mexico where I grew up. Driving down, I spent all my money that I made at my job on my car stereo and was just loving that record. And then, of course, Pump is such a fantastic sounding record as well. When you're dealing with Steve and Joe and Angus and Brian and some of these high-profile historical figures in music, you probably got over your starstruck nature of certain people a while ago. How do you treat somebody who's that historical in music?
It's funny because, I've never really been starstruck, but I do remember the first night when Aerosmith were coming in to check out the studio, and, we knew that we were going to be starting the record. I think, that Monday, and this was like a Friday night or Saturday night or something, and Bob and I were working on something. So the management team brought Stephen and Joe by the studio just to have a walk around. And I remember them walking by the control room door and across the glass partition, and they're both wearing those, floor-length duster coats. And I thought, oh my God, that's Steven Tyler and Joe Perry. And at that moment, I was like starstruck, like, because Toys in the Attic was huge when I was in high school, so they're heroes of mine. I'm like, I couldn't believe that. But once you meet them, they're all human beings, and I find, the bigger they are, the nicer they are. Funny enough, they're so down to earth, but you have to create a trust with them. What happens in the studio stays in the studio.
Mm-hmm.
I'm almost 100% truthful. I don't try and pull the wool over your eyes and say, "Oh yeah, that sounded great," and yeah, that wasn't the one, or that kind of sucked or whatever. And you create a real honest relationship with and they trust you to, whatever you say, they know you're saying how you feel about it. So it creates a really comfortable, open environment so that creativity can happen. Sometimes it's hard, and it's funny. I've talked to some people about recording schools and all that, and I said, I think those recording schools, yeah, it's great to teach the students how to use the gear and all that, and try and teach them how to listen to things, but they should have a psychology course, because that's a big part in the studio when you've got all these different personalities together. And sometimes, things might get a little bit heated between them because they're very creative, and one's got one idea and one's got another, and they can get quite heated. And you got to learn how to sort of pour cold water on that for a minute without snuffing the flame out, and just, okay, let's settle down. Okay, well, let's try it that way, or let's try that, and then let's try this. And you've got to be the go-between. I really learned that well off Bruce. Bruce Fairbairn was a master at doing all that stuff. So there's a lot of psychology. You got to learn how to really read a person from the minute they walk into the studio, and try and treat them how kind of how they want to be treated. But most of the time it's just being purely honest with them.
Yeah, such diplomatic skills being put into practice there when with competing ideas. But have you found that just straight up brutal honesty with them helps keep them on track?
Yeah, sometimes, sometimes, like, the real creative people, sometimes, in a way, doesn't like the brutal honesty, because, really, they've written a song. The song is like their child. They think their child is perfect. And you say, oh, yeah, but one eye's bigger than the other eye. And they've sort of got an overbite. How dare you call my child ugly? So sometimes you got to work through things like that and say, look, I'm just trying, I'm the outside listener, and that to me sounds like a blemish. Can we try and get rid of that blemish? And sometimes they'll, put up a bit of a struggle with that. But if you try it and they go, oh, okay, well, maybe we don't do it that way, but then it sparks another idea. Okay, well, maybe how about if we get to the chorus faster? Does that, oh yeah, that's it, So you could get sort of, you could work together on an idea without having to be so forceful. Say, well, you either got to change it or we're not doing the song. Like, you've got to be, well, let's work it out. Let's work together. I hear that as being a problem. You don't, but try it a new way and see if we like it better, kind of thing. So sometimes it's difficult because, like I say, these songs are their baby. They've, worked long and hard on it, and they're really great. They just needed a little dusting off or something like that, so.
Well, and I'm wondering, like, when to know to get in the middle of something, because I don't think it's any great secret. I mean, you can watch the Making a Pump and learn this contentious relationship between Joey Kramer and Steven Tyler. I think Steven's a drummer too, so he's got a strong sense of what he wants. And as a writer, he wants Joey to go in a particular direction or do certain things. When do you know when to get in the middle and try to just kind of smooth things over?
Yeah. Well, fortunately for me, that was Bruce. I could just sort of stay out of the line of fire, just watch the missiles go over top. Because that got to point, and I think a lot of that is in Pump, but it got to the point, like, it was almost blows sometimes, and I think Joey even stormed out of the studio a couple of times. Say, well, fine, if that's how you want it. And he says, I'm doing what I do, or what I think's doing, and if you can do it better, then you do it. And he'd storm out for the rest of the day, and there'd be points like that. So I mean, it's not easy, but for the sake of the project and the thing, like, you somehow got to calm everybody down. Now let's try it this way, and okay, Steven, you go out. And I think he even went out and played drums once, and I was like, okay, well, okay, we get what you're saying. And then Joey goes, okay, well, let me try it that way. Or, there's ways of smoothing it over, but, sometimes it can be a pretty bumpy road for sure.
What I think I'm amazed by is your realization at a young age to, oh, okay, I'll go be a janitor at Little Mountain. And you show up there with two fantastic individuals, being, Bob and Bruce, and your career starts and it just seems to take off and keep going. Have there been any bumps in the road?
I've been pretty blessed overall. I guess any bumps in the road would be when it got either too quiet or too busy. Sometimes you get yourself double and triple booked and just trying to figure out how to do it all. And I remember when I was younger, 20-hour days were common. You just have time to, and that was an hour drive to get home. So sometimes I'd just go home, just sort of have a shower, hour sleep, and then come back to work. Even at one point there, I lived at the studio in a sleeping bag in the loading bay, just so I could get a few more hours sleep. So it's like you just kind of did what you had to do. I can't really think of any sort of major bumps in the road and disasters that happened. I've done a few mixed projects where the band and I haven't clicked, and it's usually in a genre that's not really, sort of my usual wheelhouse. So, I've done a few mixes, and then we just sort of said, look, I'm not getting this, and the band says, you're not getting it. So those are, kind of failures, and I hate those, and those bug me because I'm a perfectionist or try to be, So those ones bug me, but hey, if I'm not getting it, then I'm going to be the first one to tell them and be honest with them and say, look, obviously I'm not getting it. You're not, I don't see you jumping up and down happy, or the mixes, either we change this up or, hey, I got a pass. So, there's been a couple of those.
Have you had a manager for a period of time?
Yes. Yeah. I've had a few of them actually.
Yeah. That seems to be everybody's answer when I ask them.
Well, the first one I had was a guy named Rick Alberti. He managed a guy named Mike Stone. Mike Stone had done a lot of the Queen records and whatnot. I can't think of his full discography right now, but he had come to Vancouver to do that White Snake record, the big White Snake record, with the Still the Night and all that stuff on it, right? So I was assisting on that one. So at that time, so Mike was an English engineer producer. So they always relied on the assistant to be the tape op, which the way we always ran it, the engineer ran the tape machine, the punching in, and because it was all manually punch in and punch out and all that stuff. So I had to run the tape machine, and he was just super impressed with how I could do it and without blowing at many of the punches. And so his manager had come out to visit the session and blah, blah. Anyways, we all got along. So Rick started managing me before I actually became an engineer. So I actually had a manager first. And, he wasn't actively involved too much at first because, I hadn't really got a name for myself, but he was already kind of setting up what he thought would work good for me. So, after I did the Aerosmith records, then Rick really kicked in. And I remember one of our first conversations was, he says, are you willing to travel? I said, hell yeah, man, let's wherever. So that's when I started traveling quite a lot, and he did quite well for me. Then Rick got a job back at I think it was RCA Records, A&R, and so he had to let go of his stable because there was just a conflict of interest. So he passed me on to the Lippman brothers, so Terry and Michael Lippman. They're based out of LA. So then Terry Littman was my manager for many, many years.
In your experience, do the managers primarily negotiate the deals, or do they seek the work at all?
A bit of both, but for me, I was lucky enough. I got to the point where your work sort of speaks for itself, so it's not really a hard sell. But they still actively sought work because sometimes people think, oh, Mike, he's way too busy, or he's way too expensive, or so the managers are great at sort of turning over the stones and finding the stuff, or sort of these fringe of my genres. I've done a couple country records, and there's some other stuff that's just not heavy rock that I've done, and the managers help get that, because I remember somebody had said once, to do this record. And they said, oh yeah, well, it's going to be really, keyboard, piano based. Does Mike know how to get a piano sound? Like, I'm an engineer, it's just because I record big drums and guitars doesn't mean I don't know how to do a piano sound. So, managers really help smooth those over. And then, yes, for sure, they do the deal. Because I always like sort of to play the good cop, bad cop thing. Me and my manager would discuss what rate, he would say what rate he thinks he could get for me. I would say, yeah, I'm happy with that. Or no, I'm doing that one. I want more. And then he'd be the bad cop, go to the guy, their manager, the label, and fight for my rate. And then I could just walk in the studio being, oh, well, I don't know, just talk to Rick, talk to my manager. He's sorting it out, nothing to do with me, So it really helped to have that buffer.
I know, just from a public facing way, it kind of keeps you out of that. But behind the scenes, I assume that you all are talking and saying, okay, what works, what doesn't work financially for a deal, or, plans for the future.
And then I sort of learned how to read contracts too, rather than, my manager would look over it and we'd always send it to the lawyers to get all the lawyer speak translated, because some of that stuff you're like, well, what are they even talking about? But I learned how to sort of read through contracts. So my manager would read it, he'd send it to me, I'd read it, we'd make notes, send it back to our lawyer, he'd do his change back into lawyer speak and send to their lawyer. So sometimes there's a few back and forth, but I was very much involved in all that. I just didn't let somebody do that stuff in the background. I mean, it's my career and my life, and I think you leave too many people doing stuff in the background, you get ripped off. Actually, I had a business manager for a while, and because I was away, my wife and I had split up too, so I didn't really have a home or mailing address. I was just on the road all the time. So I had all my sort of bills sent to him, and so he would just manage my money, pay the bills, that. And that worked out great for a few years, and then all of a sudden, I went to do something, and I said, oh, where'd this money go? He said, oh yeah, well, no, that. And I said, no, there should be X amount of money in this account. He goes, oh, no, but that got used for this. I said, no, it didn't. So looked at him, he was skimming, caught him skimming. So I got that right down, pulled it all back home. My mom was a bookkeeper, so I had her sort of be my business manager then. And right up until she died, she was doing all my stuff. So then I learned how to do simple bookkeeping and stuff. So I do all my own stuff now and send it off to an accountant for tax time and stuff like that. But yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Boy, that's like just like an age-old story. Someone just, embezzling, skimming.
But, for a really young age, because, when I quit school, I was 16, maybe. Mm-hmm. And so, I've sort of been self-employed my whole life. So from a very young age, I learned how to sort of manage money. Even though when I was younger, I'd cash my paycheck. And then when my wallet was empty, it was empty. But I always knew I had to do taxes, and I always put that up. So many guys that start off in this business get themselves into a hole where they just sort of making this money, and some of it just might even be band paying you cash and that, but it's still income, and you still got to claim it. And so many guys have just, I haven't even filed for 3 or 4 years. And I said, dude, they're going to catch up to you eventually, and then you're going to have a big whack. You got to stay on top of that stuff and stay on top of, your money and your budget.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Super duper critical.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, when you go to a different room and you're really not sure what you're hearing, how do you acclimate to a new space that's a foreign space?
Yeah. Well, I pretty much insist, like if I'm tracking a record, recording a record, I don't mind using a Neve console or an API, but I'd like to know the boards. Some of these different ones, they might be great sounding boards, but I don't know that board, and that's really uncomfortable for me. The other thing I insist on is NS10 speakers. Mm-hmm. I don't use anything else, but some places would have the big Yuri speakers, and we had those at Little Mount, so I know those. But any other system, I don't care how well tuned they are, and that I don't know what I'm hearing. So I have the board that I know, the speakers that I know, and I've always traveled with I've got a pair of Studer amplifiers, so I use those on my NS10, so I know that chain, what that sounds like. yes, the room will sound different, but then, you play CDs that either you've done or records that you like the sound of, and you sort of blast them, and then you get used to the room. Sometimes it takes you a couple days or so to get used to the room. Um, but it's amazing when you have all the gears quite similar. You could walk to anywhere in the world and you walk in, it's the SSL, NS10 speakers, right away where you're at. Like, I don't even take my mixes out to do the car check and that anymore. I just kind of know right away where it's sounding. And when I crank the NS10 so that they're really going, I know where the bottom end is at, because, they're not great with bottom end. I always have a little subwoofer for the NS10s because they're actually horrible sounding speakers, but I think that's why they work, because you got to work really hard to make them sound good. And I think if the NS10s sound good, loud and soft, you could take that mix anywhere and play it anywhere, and it holds up pretty good everywhere. So that's sort of my thing.
See, I'm feeling guilty now that I got rid of my NS10s years ago, because I just was like ready to move on and try something new.
Yeah. I've tried to, studios sometimes they'll have the Dynaudios or the Genelecs or, all this. You throw it on there and say, oh, yeah, okay, I like, because there's a really nice full, they got the real top and the bottom and not so honky mid-range like the NS10s. And okay, that's kind of cool. I'll work a little bit on it. And then just so, I flip over to the NS10s just to see where I'm at, where I know. And it's like, okay. Card back in. It's like, okay, I could do this weeks and not know where I'm at. Like, every time I switch back forth between speakers, it changes again until I go back to what I know. So I'm just staying with what I know. I don't even have a stereo at home, when I'm done at the studio, I'm done.
Yeah.
In the car, it's talk radio. Like, as soon as I hear music, my ears just go, oh, I don't like that kick drum sound. Oh, how did they do that on the snare? And I'm not listening to music anymore. It's
It's a curse. And I've heard so many audio professionals say, oh, I totally listen to talk radio. In the States, it's all, I'm all listening to NPR when I get in the car. I can't listen to anything else.
Yeah. Well, I just imagine what, say filmmakers do. Like, does that ruin them watching the film even if somebody else did one? Like, because, you're always watching, oh, I can see the boom stand shadow there. Oh, I can see that cut. I can, you're always tearing it apart. I mean, I could still listen to some music, especially when it's not the rock genre. I listen to some music and I still enjoy music, but I definitely do not put it on for relaxation.
Yeah. I put on a lot of 1950s jazz for relaxation.
Oh, cool. Yeah. That's cool. Yeah, I like bluegrass. And then sometimes I'll flip over to like a classical station, and some of that stuff I like too.
Stuff that you don't typically work on.
Exactly. Yeah.
When you're working, like, let's take AC/DC as an example, because you've done numerous records with them, and there's a relationship that's forged over the years. At this point, if you send out a mix, have the mix revisions become so reduced that it's negligible, or is it predictable, the same stuff every time?
It's somewhat predictable. Depends on the band. Like with AC/DC, both Malcolm and Angus would stay in town while I'm mixing, so I would mix, and then they'd come down when I had the mix ready for a listen. They'd have a listen, and sometimes they'd say, "Oh, can you make the vocal a little more present, or can you do this?" Or, "Yep, that sounds good." There'd be little tweaks. Nowadays, that I mostly mix on my own. The band's out of town somewhere, and I just send them a reference mix when I'm at that point. Most of the time it's little things like, that they thought the vocal should have, some more delays or reverb on it, or sometimes they want it drier. Like, so many ways of thinking of vocals that I never know which way the band wants it. I try and do how I feel it, and sometimes that's too 80s, it's too wet and stuff. So then I'll do a super dry vocal, and then that band will go, oh, no, we want it to sound expensive with all the delays and reverb. So sometimes there's a bit of that until after you've mixed. If you're doing the whole record, sometimes it'll take the second mix or even into the third mix before okay, now I see what's, because I'm making the record for them, not me. It's like, I do what I feel, but I got to feel try and clue into what they're expecting and what they want. You know, they could say, "Oh, we want to sound like Led Zeppelin." But yeah, you're not gonna unless you have Jimmy and Robert Plant and you know. So, you know, I could take it in that direction, but, you know, until you find out where they want to go with it, you know, sometimes there's more revisions than not. Rarely, if at all, I've ever had something come back and we got to tear it right down, say, "Oh, no, the drums are wrong and this is wrong." And can we, you know, that hardly happens at all. It's usually little things, vocal levels. I like the vocals tucked in. I like the band to sound huge. And, you know, obviously on some genres, you know, like the country and that kind of stuff, you know, the vocals have got to be the loudest thing. But I have a hard time mixing it like that because I'm a band. I like the band being big. Like I'll spend most of the day with just the band and then sort of the last quarter of the day spent fitting the vocal in. So, you know, until you turn the vocals, "Oh, I used to like the song and now that vocal's ruining it. It's in the way of that guitar part that I liked," and, you know, stuff like that. So I tend to kind of talk the vocal a little bit too back, but that's just so that the band sounds bigger.
And have you, for the most part, maintained your workflow? And I'm making a giant assumption here. I'm assuming you're mixing through an SSL at this point?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Where is your spot for mixing primarily?
Last bunch of years have been mostly out of the Armory studios, but we've also got the Warehouse studios here too. So it's
that's
bounced
right.
back between those two.
The Warehouse, is that
Brian Adams'
Brian
place.
Adams' place,
Yeah.
right? I was going to spacing
And
on
then
Brian's name.
the Armory was Bruce Fairbairn's place. So when he passed, his family retained ownership and they still run it.
Do you have an assistant that preps files for you?
I have, yes, an assistant. I've trained quite a few over my years, but I have a really good one right now. Her name is Jessica, and yeah, she preps files only so much as, you know, I like them color coded a certain way so I can just glance and I know that that's drums and those are guitars. She kind of knows how I like to group things if things need to be grouped, but, you know, we go through when I come in, I go, "Oh yeah, no, I want it like that." But she'll get it basically ready. She'll use the cut triggers for me, kick and snare triggers, so that we can, if I need to put samples on, we can do that quickly. So it's pretty prepped. You know, I've heard, like, say, Chris Lord-Alge's assistants, you know, if they get a session with, you know, 72 tracks, they'll bounce things down to a 48 track for Chris to mix from. I don't do that. I like to get that portion myself, and my assistants get used to what I like grouped together, and they'll sort of do it, but we don't bounce it down.
And over the years, have you migrated it all to a hybrid thing where it's a combination of plugins and outboard?
Nah, I'm an outboard guy and very little of the outboard. I mean, I will use some plugins. Like there's the plug-in de-essers were way better than the outboard de-essers. So happy to see those come in because the outboard ones, you know, you'd either have a lift or you're still getting stuff through, and sometimes you'd have to put 2 or 3 de-essers all set a little differently to kind of get it. Whereas you could really zero in on the plug-in stuff. So I like those. You know, there's some, you know, delays and stuff, some reverbs that are great. I like the plug-in delays sometimes because you can program them to do different things and pan around and all this stuff. Whereas if you use the outboard stuff, you're doing all manual panning in the mix, and I hate that. But I like the sound of the outboard stuff way better.
But minimal outboard.
Basically, Matt, I'm lazy, so I hate spending the time setting all this up and running this and running something through 10 different things and little subtle EQs. Like I just crank it. No, don't like that. Okay, well, that's good. And then I'm done.
And then other than that, is it a lot of dependency on the SSL dynamics and EQ?
Dynamics, EQ, and balancing. You just got to get things balanced and that. And, you know, I was going to say earlier too, that was part of, you know, with Bruce and Bob and I way back in the day, you know, Vancouver wasn't a big recording town like, say, Toronto and New York and Los Angeles and all that. So there wasn't much gear or you know, really nice tube mics or all that. You know, we just sort of had these basic stuff. And it wasn't until, well, it's probably well after the Loverboy stuff that, we got to say travel down to LA and record a session down there. And once you started traveling, you realized, oh, that's how they made these records. They've got that piece of gear, and oh, they use this and that compressor. I've never even heard of that compressor. So we were trying to make our records sound like, competing with all the other records out there, and we had to work really hard at it to make them pop like their stuff was. And then we found out later that it's all this great gear they had. we didn't. I think we had 2 delay units, a reverb thing, and there might have been a couple outboard compressors, but that was it. Like, we didn't have all this fancy smanchy stuff. So it's like, and to get delays, it was all tape slap, and then we had to, if we want a really long delay, you had to run it off one machine and run the big loop all the way around, and get it timed into the song. Like, we worked hard to get things going. And so I think that's why I'm a minimalist now, because I just work hard at making the mix sound good and less time on tweaking this and running it through there. Okay, now let's see what happens when we run it here. It's like, I just want to put the song up, get it balanced, and say, okay, what does it need? A little bit of reverb on the vocal, a little delay throw on the solo. Okay, it's rocking. That's sort of my approach.
Clearly that's worked for you.
Yeah. But again, that's probably why I probably have quite a narrow genre that I work in. Why do you always get all the rock stuff? Well, because I get it and I like it. I like all other genres too, but some of those might need more detail to delay stuff, whereas rock, you can just kind of throw it up there and make it kick you in the face, and there you go.
I'm curious if you've seen over the years a reduction in work in the rock area. Well,
it definitely has been a reduction. I know I sort of know more up here in Canada than down in the States, because I'm down there in a while and driving around in the car with radio. But rock radio pretty much does not exist in Canada anymore. The rock stations that are out there are sort of the golden oldies, so they'll play all the 80s and 90s stuff. And I can't think of a station you can hear new rock. And the death of that was when they sort of, you still got the DJs, but it's all carted, so it's all pre-recorded stuff. So even if you phone in a request, they look at their cart, and if that isn't anywhere on their cart, they can't play it. So I remember some of the DJs here in Vancouver, when they had the midnight shift, we'd send them some of the local stuff that we're working on, and here, check this out, we just finished mixing this tonight, and they'd throw it on the radio and get calls in on it. And so that was fun. And that's, when there was real DJs out there, that's what made hit records, and it was really rock driven. But now that it's carted, it's sort of, I believe radio's been dictated by, the advertising and stuff. So, but we're aiming for this demographic now, so now the rock demographic is over 30, right? So they're aiming for the 14 to 25-year-olds or something like that. Well, okay, those kids have, they've got a different thing. I know, my kids and some of my grandkids now still like rock music, but really they listen to the more, hip hop and R&B stuff, because that's in their culture. That's what's been showed to them. So, that's changed, even in our era, they changed from whether, soft rock or pop rock or whatever it was to heavier rock, and then, and metal, and then, so we've had our go, and it's, it's always this. But yeah, rock's a tougher thing. It's gone more underground. I think there's still a ton of fans out there, and you can see it on the rock, tours. Mm-hmm. They always sell out. They've always got the big thing, but you don't, up here anyway, you don't hear much on the radio. So it's a less driven thing, and it's not pushed in the markets as much as it used to be, for sure.
I've got a couple different Instagram accounts, and in my engineer account, I primarily follow bands. And as a result, the algorithm is constantly feeding me bands that are spending money to promote themselves. And I just get a deluge of rock bands. And it's really, really inspiring, I have to say, being a fan of rock music primarily.
Yeah. And it's getting tougher too, though, Matt, because, there's no longer record sales. There's very, very few physical sales anymore, and everybody just streams it because that's how they want to get their music. On their phone is handy. They can listen to whatever, whenever they want without carrying a backpack around full of CDs or cassettes or something in it, So I get it, but with the rate that artists are getting paid from Spotify and all that, it's like, Spotify is making billions of dollars and artists are making cents.
Yeah.
So the budgets have really chopped down. So now these bands can't afford to fly up here to Vancouver, pay a studio and pay me to do a record. Sometimes they can afford to fly me down there, but still there's that cost. And if they've only got, say, $5,000 to do an 8-song record, well, they're going to use that up in a day. So, it's really tough. Yeah. And it's, back in the heyday, yes, it was a bit crazy. There'd be $500,000 to $1 million budgets. I mean, yeah, that's crazy. But, surely to goodness, there's something in between, I mean, I don't really have a rate anymore. I try and adjust to what the band's budget is when at all possible. I mean, I obviously, if they've got, say $500 to mix 10 songs, I can't do it for that. It costs me that in gas to get back and forth, and then the studio's on top of that. So, there are limitations, but, I get it. You don't have a budget. Well, let's get it out there. And, I'll usually get a point or two off a record. So that used to help. But now the physical sales gone. Yeah, there's just not money enough to drive these new bands up to their full potential anymore. And I think all our airwaves and internet and that is just flooded with so much music now. It's really hard to rise above the noise. I mean, you've got to be really diligent and really look to find some really cool stuff. The algorithms help, but then I think they hinder too. Like, they just give you all the stuff that it thinks you want to hear instead of, here, you might want to listen to this. It's not really in your wheelhouse, but check this out, So I miss that from radio. Radio used to do that a lot. Like, you'd be listening, oh, here's a new thing. And sometimes you go, whoa, who is this? Oh, I love this. I don't get that anymore.
I'm curious when you're getting tracks to mix, I think it's a given that when you're dealing with a major artist like AC/DC, it's going to be well recorded. Whether it's you or someone else recording it is my point. But do you ever these days get tracks that are just, need a lot of love?
Yeah, actually, most of the time now, because there's more and more home studios. Even sort of the mid-range artists, they might track drums in a drum room, but then they'll take it back to their home and do all their own stuff. And some of them have pretty, so let's say cheaper microphones and cheaper vocal chains and stuff. And so you could really hear it when say if it's recorded fairly dull and you're trying to brighten it up. On the cheaper stuff, the brightness just ends up being harsh. There's no silk to anything. So it's sometimes a constant challenge. And, but again, when I get stuff, my first thing is I like to just do a quick rough mix, faders up, and see where the song wants to go, because to me, it's all about the song. And hopefully just by putting the faders up, that's when they were recording it, that's kind of what they had. And then you could kind of pick where it kind of needs to go. And then I take it there. So I don't necessarily get a project and solo the drums right away and go, here's how I like the drums to sound. And here's how I like the guitars to sound, and then try and fit them together. I'd like to see what does they sound overall. And then I go, okay, that snare needs a little bit more crack to it than what they've got on it, and stuff like that. But I like to see where it wants to go first before I make any judgment on the quality.
And then you mentioned drum samples earlier. Do you have a prescribed method, or is that secret sauce that you don't like to talk about?
No, I have a prescribed method, and it's basically all manual. I have my assistant go through every kick and snare. And basically, you tap the transient, you find the first transient, and then I usually capture the first 2 waveforms, because that's got all your dynamic information. So we do that first. Then I just throw my samples in with Sound Replacer, and it's perfect every time. There's no flamming, there's no fade. Like, some of these sample programs work a little bit, and then you can hear them flamming, and then they go out of phase. Like they're wandering, and that drives me crazy because I don't like replacing drums. I like to add a sample in that enhances the real drum. So most of the time you can't tell I have a sample on it. It sounds like the real drums. So this resampling has to be completely accurate and dynamic.
You're so old school in using sound replacer. I love it.
Yeah, it's great. It's awesome.
I used to have the issue with it where I would do a pass and then I would have to go back because it wasn't always sample accurate, but maybe your technique of just taking the first.
Well, how would you trigger it? Just a gated snare or something, or?
I would take the kick, for example, and I would highlight it and then hit sound replacer and choose the sample you're going to use.
Because when you manually go through and tap the transient, sometimes it'll be like, it'll miss one. Sometimes it'll be, so you've got to physically go through and find where that starts. And it becomes quite apparent where that is. But sometimes, especially it's got kick and snare at the same time. If you got a lot of snare bleed, you got to find out which one's the kick and which one's the snare. And like sometimes it's time consuming, but the end result is awesome.
I'm going to go back and revisit sound replacer then based on that information. That's great.
And then, sometimes I'll use, maybe I won't put a sample in the thing, but my system still goes through and makes the trigger track for me. But say I'm having a problem with the snare, like there's just so much hi-hat and cymbals and all that, and you put a gate on it, but sometimes the cymbal or the hi-hat's louder than the snare is, so it's opening up there, but not opening up for the snare, and it's just like, I can't do I'll just use my trigger track now and key the gate, and there you go every time. So I can crank that right down every time the snare trigger hits, the gate opens. It's awesome. I'm actually having a company look at making me that plug-in that does that.
That does the gating or the triggering of the gate?
Thinking the triggers and everything, because, and the trick is as working with Pro Tools, you can go on a snare and tab the transient and it doesn't grab them all, or sometimes it'll be in this weird spot. Like, why is the transient there? Maybe it's a little ping off the cymbal or something that's moved it to, like, so you've almost got to manually do it. Mm-hmm. So I want a program that gets past that and can do it properly.
That's great.
Something in the works, but I might be way too late because most people don't do that anymore, or they use these sample programs.
I'll be curious to try it out.
Some people, when they're using samples, are basically replacing the drum. From some of the sample programs I've heard, they've got actually really good sample packages. The snares sound really good, and they've got separate room track. Like you can really build a drum kit as a drum machine. So I think when they use these sample programs, if you're replacing the drums, you're not going to have the problem of it flamming and phasing because they are what they are. But when I'm using the real drums, it's got to be right with what the real drums are doing.
Work-life balance. You did a lot of travel. You have 4 kids. I know that can be challenging. Do you have any thoughts that you want to share with others about things to keep in mind if you want to,
Yeah, well, you know what? I had a great wife. I mean, we've been together and then split up twice. Now we're split up again, but we're best friends when we're apart. When we're together, but she's great. She's a wonderful woman. All she wanted to do is stay at home and raise the kids. She said, you do the career, you do that, and I'll do this. And that was kind of our deal. Like even when they were little babies, I never had to get up and do the 3 or 4 a.m. feeding time, or rarely had to. She says, "Nope, that's me. You just got home half an hour ago. You still sleep." So she was always awesome, and that's what made it work. And I don't see that working in too many other marriages, because it's, it should be more of like a team effort. It's like, okay, it's your turn tonight and that. But, having a career that, some days are 14, 16-hour days, it's just really tough to, okay, it's your turn to walk the kid around the block, whatever, so it's, I just had a really, really great wife that helped me through all that.
We talked a little bit about money earlier. when it comes to gear, have you, for the most part, depended on the studios that you've worked at to provide the gear, or have you accumulated a fair amount of stuff over the years?
For the most part, I've always relied on the studio because there's always so much, new stuff and this and that, and I just didn't have the money to buy all that, or where am I going to keep all that gear? But over the years, it for sure have amassed a few things, some, favorite delays, the Nexon 42s. I love those. I've got a Soundtech EQ I usually put that on the stereo bus. Got a couple compressors. I've got this great 1176 Blackface. It's just sounds amazing. So I've got a few bits and pieces that are just like, the cool bits. Maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 sort of rack-mounted space stuff, but not a lot. I went and bought a bunch of microphones, mostly 57s and 421s, because that's pretty much all I use on almost everything. So that when I go on remote recordings, sometimes we'll get a cool little cheaper studio, or even like sometimes do the overdubs in the band's rehearsal place. Well, then now you're renting microphones. So I thought, I'll just buy my own microphones, and I've always got those. So I've got that. But, I thought, hey, the studio's got way more money to invest in gear than me.
Yeah.
And the same thing with plugins too. Like, I don't buy plugins or do any of that. So I rely on the studio stuff. And then it's funny, sometimes you get files sent to you, and they've used all these plugins that even the studio doesn't have. So it's, there's just so many thousands of different kinds of plugins. I always tell everybody, well, if that plugin was part of the sound you want, print it.
Yeah.
That'd be like running your guitar through a bunch of pedals to get a sound and then just printing the DI. Like, print the sound.
That approach that you've taken over the years with the gear has prevented you from going into great debt with gear and overbuying gear, because it's all around you. That's something we've talked about a lot on the show over the years is people going into debt for gear and, thinking, if I get that one piece of gear, I'll get the gig, or my stuff will sound that much better.
And as we all know, nothing is invented equal. So like, say you in ACDC, or, Angus Young uses this kind of Marshall. Okay, you could find the exact same Marshall, and it's not going to be anywhere near him, because each piece of gear sounds different. They might have similar qualities, but just because, I use this 1176 on lead vocals doesn't mean you grab another 1176 and it's going to sound like that, because mine, I've A-B'd it with other ones, and it's just got this thing to it that's just like awesome. So, you could spend the money on the gear, it's still not going to sound the same.
One thing, and I don't know if you've run into this, but I've talked to some pretty, well-known producer engineers who have quite nice credit lists, and who have done records that people say their name and everybody goes, oh, of course. But there's also this trend of younger people, the younger generation coming up saying, Mike Fraser, well, who are you? What have you done? And it's just that disconnect between the generations. Have you run into any of that at all with, trying to get work, or for the most part, is that avoided because of your history and the relationships and the management you have?
Well, I would say for sure in the last 10 years, I don't think that's ever been a thing. But, it was quite far along into my career that sometimes, guys at the label say, hey, can you send me a demo reel? So then my manager would send them my discography. He says, oh, yeah, but we want to hear something. Okay. So, but that doesn't really happen much anymore. I don't know why. Or maybe I just don't get calls from kids. Maybe it's still all the old parts.
Yeah, that could be true.
It's great, because most of the time, none of my neighbors even, lived in the same house for 35 years, and none of my neighbors really had a clue of what I did. So I could just be me when I'm at home. My kids didn't give a crap what, say, oh yeah, dad works. But some of their friends would find out what I did, and they'd go, oh, Mr. Fraser, we've got this band. Can you come over and listen to our band? Or something. It's something really cool. But generally, I've got a pretty awesome incognito life. So it's I love it.
You've kind of stayed kind of low key about things. Is that on purpose?
Well, yeah. I don't really like the endorsement things too much, because And again, there's not a lot of things I use. So, I might be approached by a plug-in company to push this and that. And I go, yeah, but I don't really use it. And they say, oh, that doesn't matter. We'll send you all our other plug-ins if you just do a couple. I'm like, yeah, no. And to be honest, back in the sort of the booming years, I was too busy to do any of that stuff. I just didn't have time,
Yeah.
So fine, I'd probably do a few more of these podcast things now because I've got time to sit and talk to you. But, if I was working today, it'd be like, sorry, I'll give you 10 minutes and then I got to get back to work. So, this is fun, and this is, it's easier to do now that it's a little quieter. But I like being, just being, it's almost like I got two personalities. At work, it's Phrase, and at home, it's Mike. And I like being just Mike, I've got that hour drive into the studio, so that really puts that distance between. So when I leave work, by the time I get home, I'm back to being Mike mode and hang out with my dog. And, it's awesome.
I don't know if you've ever watched it, but if you have a chance, what you just described is very similar to a show on Apple TV called Severance. Severance, yeah, where they implant this little chip in the worker's head so that when they're at home, they're one person, but then when they go through this elevator and go down a few floors, they only know what work is. And so it's like having a split personality. And it's your severance moment is your time in the car, the hour drive to the studio.
Okay, that's interesting. Because, I think that's what's kept me sane, is having that, split personality, if you would. Because I could just really get involved at work, and then I don't bring work home.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for making time for me. I'm so happy to be able to chat with you. I realize that between your work and Bob's work and Bruce's work, everything that started there at Little Mountain played a fairly big role in inspiring me as not only early on as a player, as a drummer, but as an engineer, to go back to those records and realize, oh yeah, that influenced you completely. Yeah, so I'm so grateful that we got to chat.
Matt, is an absolute pleasure. Thank you for reaching out, and I don't think I've enjoyed myself so much as I have today. So thank you very much. Great questions, and yeah, awesome.
Well, thank you.
Help I could be in the future, let me know.
Excellent. Thank you.
See you later.